Ms. Pinnock.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please support. At this time, the defense rests.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the defense has rested. That means you have heard all of the evidence in this case. What we have remained.
All right, did we miss anything? Let's bring in Court TV legal correspondent Chanley Painter, who's joining us live from Columbia, South Carolina tonight. Chanley, great to see you. Let me start here, because to me this is, as we focus in on what this case ultimately is about, the trial at least, trying to figure it out in terms of the facts, what evidence did this jury hear that someone else had access to the car? What evidence did this jury hear that someone else was driving the car? What evidence did this jury hear that the defendant didn't know where his car was for a certain amount of time? Because to me, that's really what this is all about. And am I correct that we didn't really hear anything from the defense case necessarily today?
You are correct, Vinny. In fact, the prosecution tediously over the past 5 days trying to build piece by piece through surveillance video, DNA evidence, the testimony of two ex-girlfriends who did have access to that car. And there's no answers really to those questions that you just posed because the defense chose not to put on a case. Now there's closing arguments tomorrow. We expect the prosecution to wrap it up all together about why they believe that he was the only one in that vehicle. If you go back to that Wendy surveillance video from several days ago, you may remember they placed him inside his car at the Wendy's just before, that midnight or so it was that evening. So we know that he's in there then. And then they tediously try to piece together the clothing that we see at the ATMs before 5 a.m., before 6 a.m. They tie that clothing to the defendant, corroborated by his girlfriend who he was staying with. So it's an avalanche. Let me quote the judge today, an avalanche of circumstantial and direct evidence pointing only to one person, Nathaniel Rowland. Okay,
so again, what has this jury heard anything? Something that they could perhaps infer through the cross-examination that was done by the defense? Because I know what all the defense attorneys are saying right now, Chanley. We don't have to prove anything. We have no burden. We have to put any evidence on. We don't have to put out a witness. The defendant doesn't have to testify. I know all of that. Well, did anything come up during cross-examination where a juror might think, oh, well, who had the car at that point?
Absolutely. In fact, the very last witness for the prosecution's case in chief, he poured through 25 hours of surveillance video and really became technically savvy, piecing together for a timeline the evening of the murder. We follow this black Chevy Impala around the 5 Points. Samantha Josephson gets in this car. There was only one question on cross-examination, and that was, did you at any time, okay, there was more, there's maybe two questions. Did you at any time see the defendant, Nathaniel Rowland, in any of this video, this 25 hours worth of surveillance video? And he said no. Anytime in the videos, did you see who was driving this car? And he said no, and she said no further questions. And I think that right there is going to be the crutch of the closing for the defense in this case. Can the prosecution, beyond a reasonable doubt, put him behind the wheel of that car right there?
And yet that, again, laser focus on what this is all about, because the crime scene, and just talking about the crime scene, I mean, what happened to Samantha Josephson was described in great detail inside that courtroom. Give us a take on how that went over and what those moments were like, and was Samantha's family in the courtroom for all of this?
Vinny, it was an extra difficult day for really everyone inside the courtroom, but especially the family of Samantha Josephson. Now, her parents were warned ahead of time about the medical examiner's testimony, so they left the courtroom. They were not in there, but there were still several rows of her friends and family, including her boyfriend, that testified during the trial, reacting emotionally. It's difficult to hear about the injuries she sustained. 120 stab wounds, literally from her head to her feet, different levels, puncturing her brain at one point, her jugular vein, and she bled out slowly. This was a slow, tortuous death. Difficult to hear, much less for this jury, Vinny, who had to actually see some photos of the autopsy and what the medical examiner was specifically showing them about how he was able to piece together what the murder weapon would have looked like. And he corroborated that with the prosecution's case pretty clearly about the stab wounds being perfectly parallel to each other. He said there's only one tool that could make that, and he held up the multi-tool, which the prosecution has already tied to this defendant. In fact, his DNA is on that murder weapon and the victim's.
Difficult day for that family. It is so tough. So tough. All right, Chanley Painter, we'll get back to you in just a second. I want to bring in our think tank tonight. Joining us in Atlanta, Georgia, Judge Gino Brogdon. In Fort Lauderdale, Florida, criminal defense attorney, civil rights attorney, Kesia Early. And in Chicago, Illinois, criminal defense attorney and the attorney for entertainer R. Kelly, Steve Greenberg, back with us. All right, great to see everyone. Steve, let me start with you. And I want to get to that laser focus as I see what this trial is about. The crime scene, we believe, and I'm convinced at least, is the defendant's car. And it looks like the closest they're going to come to any evidence that he's not driving is, well, you didn't see him on those videos behind the wheel. You couldn't tell who was behind the wheel, though.
Right, which ordinarily would be a good defense if the car had been reported missing or stolen or anything like that. And that's the problem here, is there's no report of anything happening with this car, either around that time, shortly afterwards, the next day, or anything like that. There's no explanation. So ultimately, they're going to argue that this is a circumstantial case. It's his car. There's no evidence that someone else was driving it. They'll probably get some objections for burden shifting at that point, and it's going to be problematic. If he had something else, if he had some kind of a report of someone else driving the car, I think they might have a shot without anyone else driving it. But it's just an odd case.
Kesia, and sometimes the defense doesn't present a case because the defendant's guilty and they don't have any evidence showing that he's not guilty.
I was actually surprised that the defense didn't even present not one rebuttal witness, even if it was a DNA expert, to kind of poke holes in the prosecution's case. The fact that they did not present that, I don't know if it was strategic or if they wanted to take advantage of the sandwich where they had the opportunity to present a rebuttal closing. But to me, that was not sufficient because, with the jury instructions, the judge will advise you that closing is not evidence. So if that was strategic, that was sweet. So I'm really thinking about this case, and I believe that the prosecution met its burden.
And Judge, obviously the jury can't hold it against the defendant for not testifying, and we would never want any juror to do that. But presenting no evidence whatsoever, sometimes it's just because the defendant is actually guilty.
Absolutely. One other explanation too, Vinny, and good to see you, by the way. One other explanation too is that they had some evidence to put up, but the risk that it would have made it worse was too great. So they decided to sit on it and hope that the jurors will just say, well, you couldn't see him in the car, and try to figure out a way to give him a break. This is a mountain of incriminating evidence, and people can argue circumstantial. Most cases, unless it's on video or you've got a confession, it's circumstantial evidence, that which allows us to infer the ultimate, which is that he was the killer. The only way out of this for the defendant is for the jury to say, because we couldn't see him, that creates reasonable doubt and thus not enough. But the other evidence linking him to this young lady and to this horrible crime, I think I grow hair faster than he gets an acquittal.
Let's take a listen to Thomas Beaver, who's the forensic pathologist who testified today, and what a way to close out the case for prosecutors on that final day, for them to hear what exactly happened to Samantha Josephson.
Perform this autopsy. Did you, because of the number of stab wounds, as you mentioned, did you do them in groupings? Did you try to group them differently than you normally would?
Yes, sir. Once the number gets up around 100, it really makes the autopsy report and any description very bulky. So I try to group them where they're closely together and related. So yes, I'll group them into groups of 5 or 6 or 8 in a certain area.
And you mentioned the number 100. Were you able to count the number of stab wounds as you observed Ms. Josephson's body?
Yes, it's over 100, I think somewhere around 120. But gets to a point where it's not really, it doesn't really add much to the report. Yes, so she has bruising over the forehead and the right side of her face. She has a stab wound in the eyebrow. She has a number of other stab wounds on the right side of the face.
Now, may I interrupt you for a moment? You said a stab wound to the eyebrow.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so a moment ago you mentioned you take x-rays, correct?
Yes, sir.
And one of the reasons you take those, as you said, was to see if there may be damage to a weapon, to a knife?
Yes, sir. This is the primary reason. When I saw these stab wounds to the head, the skull is a very hard bone, very thick, and stabbing the skull frequently results in the knife bending or breaking. And so it immediately alerted me to take x-rays because we might have a piece of the knife actually embedded in the skull.
You know, Steve, we've learned a lot about what happened here, but not really why it happened. And many times in a case like this, you would think it was something very personal. But this is a brutal, brutal killing. Does that lingering question of why have any impact on this case?
Well, a jury doesn't have to decide why, but you obviously are going to wonder why. It's much easier for a jury ordinarily to convict if there's a motive. The government never has to prove motive in a crime, but obviously if they have a motive, now they've got a better story to tell. On something just random like this, and I heard earlier on an earlier show where they were talking about how many people like this guy and his family's all there. He had a good upbringing and all that. You have to just wonder if he had some kind of a psychotic break or something because of the number of stab wounds. The number is so extensive. And if there's no crime of passion here, then why would you have such a vicious crime? I don't know if they explored that kind of a defense, some kind of a mitigated defense, because it doesn't sound like they had any other defense. So I'd be surprised if they didn't.
And KC, a murder this brutal, I mean, to me, the jury wants to hold someone responsible because they don't want to have someone like that walking around the streets of Columbia, South Carolina.
I agree. And when I heard about how many stab wounds, and he said the number wasn't sufficient after 100, so it was about 120. Oftentimes when you hear about that, the victim either knows the perpetrator or the person that she's being attacked from. But in this case, it appears in the way the prosecution set it up that this was a random act. He was circling around like a shark, trying to find the perfect fate or the perfect victim in this case. So that kind of struck me as odd, the fact that there were so many stab wounds, yet there's no connection whatsoever. And again, I agree, no motive. So why? But with so much evidence that the prosecution was able to bring out, this case definitely points that he's the only one who did it.
Let's bring back in Court TV legal correspondent Chanley Painter. Chanley, give us an idea. What's happening tomorrow? What's the schedule, and what can we expect?
It'll be a big day. Everyone needs to tune in first thing in the morning because closing arguments will begin immediately, 9:30 Eastern. The prosecution goes first, and because the defense chose not to put on a case, that means in South Carolina, they get the last word. So the defense will wrap up. Each side will probably take about an hour. That's what they estimated before the judge today. Then the judge will instruct the jury. We will be in a verdict watch, and there's no set time limits for how long they can deliberate tomorrow, Vinny. So we may even be in a verdict watch in your show tomorrow night.
All right, another big day tomorrow here on Court TV. Chanley Painter, thank you so much.